Good evening. We're going to get started. Try to keep us on track here and be respectful of everyone's time. Hey, Gene. You got seats open everywhere. Have a seat. Welcome. Well, thank you all for being here. We're going to get going. First order of business, I think we have a quorum. We can move with the approval of the minutes from the November meeting. Are there any questions, corrections, or anything else that needs to be from anyone for the minutes? If not, do we have a motion? Mr. Sheldon, second?
I'll second.
Eugene, thank you very much. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstentions? All right, thank you. Okay, we'll move on to the new business, the first item. A discussion over the presentation from Forsyth. I gave some, well, first of all, thank you all for all of your feedback from the presentation in November, and I heard you, and I hear you, and I very much appreciate your engagement and your feedback on it. But and I do have some things to share, similar to what I've already expressed to you in an email a short time ago. But I think there is some interest again to talk a little bit more about that tonight. So first of all, I want to open the floor to you, to hear from you and what your perspectives or experiences or opinion, and give us the feedback directly on the Forsyth presentation. Because I know that there were varying opinions of its usefulness and effectiveness and relevance and all of that sort of thing. But I want to hear from you and what your experience and what your perspective was on that. That'll be the first item that we discuss tonight. And then I'll have a couple of things, brief things to say to close us out on the conversation. But I want to open the floor for you to discuss that now. Anyone?
I just took the presentation as it was, just information and stuff, because some of the stuff that he presented was relevant, some of it wasn't. So I just took what may have been relevant to what we're trying to do. The rest of it, I'm just like, okay. It just, like, it wasn't anything for me to, say hoorah, nay, or whatever. I just take presentations, and I had a conversation. Maybe it's just I'm used to the approach he had, because I've been in trainings with law enforcement leading it. So for me, I didn't see anything wrong with it. And maybe it's just that I'm a little jaded. I don't know, or just used to that type of presentation. So for me, it was just almost normal, and I just took what I needed to out of it. The rest of it, I let it go.
Okay, thank you.
I'll share a different perspective.
Okay.
I really wrote notes because for me this is kind of intense. I've been working with BPD and the Community Guard and Policing Group for 3 or 4 years, and to me it felt a bit shocking because I felt it was a direct attack on community policing. I know everybody may not feel that way, but it felt that way to me. And I felt because we already sent a letter telling all of our concerns, and it was like, well, we're going to bring him and you'll have time to ask questions, but there wasn't time to ask questions. And then when we wrote our things, it just felt, because I think what he was saying was, he actually said that community policing and anything, there is no such thing as bias training, and all those things are, he said it wasn't realistic, couldn't use it. But the particular judgment says specifically you have to do community policing, big part of it. And also bias training, which was mentioned several times. So it felt so contradictory, and it also was frightening to know that, I read some of their ads where in Ohio they advertise, shoot someone in the back and get away with it. They actually advertise that. for his presentation.
For science, advertise it that way?
And they fully pulled it back as soon as the media came in. But I mean, after hearing those kind of things, it's frightening, because, and also the evidence that the lawyers presented, that there are people suing them because they feel that they encourage police violence. So I think it was very controversial and felt kind of a little disrespectful that we weren't, that wasn't part of a collaboration. They were brought in with that, and even after we were concerned, it didn't, you know, so that's, for me, that's a big, that's where I feel right now. And I hope we can work it out and talk about specifically which parts that BPD does not accept.
Yeah.
Where did you say that ad was from, before it got pulled?
It was in Ohio several years ago. It was several years ago, so maybe they're not saying that anymore. I could, if I find it, I'll, you know, I looked up so many things, I'll see if I can find it.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Yes.
Not to be, it just kind of felt after I left, kind of like all the work that we're doing was for nothing, because some of his presentation kind of made me feel like everything that we're trying to attempt here is unrealistic in law enforcement perspective. And so I left here feeling a little disappointed, or like, or that maybe we're not going to be effective, or we're not going to be successful. And of course, I'm hoping to be successful in improving community and police relations.
Yeah, as am I. Thank you. Okay.
I don't think I got that impression. This presentation was just showing two sides of everything. And a lot of times we always look from the outside. We're looking from the community side. I think he was just presenting an argument that sometimes officers, case by case, see things differently. Just like when he mentioned the body cam. Sometimes the body cam can show one, but they're actually looking at something else, like he pointed out. So I kind of get both sides, that I can't just use, like most of you, I grew up in the streets. If you asked me this 20 years ago, I'd tell you I hate the police. But once you get to know, I don't think that's what he was presenting. He was just trying to show you that sometimes officers have to think different when they're on patrol because of situations. And unless you really seen those situations, kind of like going to do that was the simulator thing. When you put yourself in a position to see how you will respond. You know, how many people have on the panel actually went and did a simulator yet to see some of the scenarios that officers have to go through. So if you haven't done that, then I advise you to at least try, because I think he was just giving another side that we should look at and observe. He's not saying that's the only way, but it's just one way. And that was my point, my view. And I didn't get offended by the questions, because I think we was asking, like I said, I think we should hold questions to the end and not keep the meetings going longer because we got questions in between. So that's my opinion.
Okay, thank you. Melissa?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all hear side differently, but purposefully, I don't think it was useful. At no point do you really talk about use of force standards in California. Again, not to repeat what some of the partners members here said, but to insinuate that California is like pushing for a progressive idea that is not feasible, again, contradicts the stipulated judgment, which is why what I had most problem with, and because he wasn't really providing any expertise on use of force or like best practice in other states or anything else other than, I view it as a propaganda of like, oh, you know, well, you're not law enforcement, so you wouldn't understand what they go through. But I understand that we're not law enforcement, but we also live in the community, and we're on the other end when we call 911 or when our community members call 911. So I think we're trying to figure out like how do we best work collaboratively together so we can reduce use of force incidents. I mean, that's the goal. And so, for me, it was not helpful. It was contradictory. It was more of a campaign, and there was no best practice model that were introduced.
Okay, thank you. Chuck?
I've kind of put some of my views out there in a couple of emails, so this won't be surprising. But my concern about the presentation was that, one, it was an educational opportunity that did not contribute to the education of this group in terms of the tasks that we have before us. We certainly learned some things, and I agree with those of you who said, yeah, there was stuff we learned, and some of that was helpful. So I would not say that it was a completely meaningless exercise, but I think that if we do something of this nature in the future, we need to make sure that the presentation is balanced and doesn't begin and end with a bias against the kind of progressive work that we're trying to accomplish here. And I certainly agree with the folks who at the end of the presentation felt like, oh, what are we doing? Because there was nearly an accusation that to ask for different styles of policing, we as community members are putting our police officers in harm's way. And I certainly came away with that feeling. And I wondered, what am I doing here? I felt guilty. And so that's, I just thought that it could have been so much better if it had been balanced, if we had a presenter that had a grasp of what we were trying to do and an appreciation for the need for change in policing.
Thank you, Chuck.
I agree with the sentiment shared with Chuck. I was part of the small coalition that expressed concerns prior to the presentation. And then once, we received word that BPD was going to move forward with Bonfire, I really came hoping that we would receive some tools for our analysis in taking on this use of force policy and some additional context, and I didn't see that. I was really disappointed. I felt, like Chuck said, that there was no appreciation for the work that we're trying to do, and we were told essentially California is crazy for thinking that this can be achieved. And he explicitly said, you're trying to enforce a law that is unenforceable. It can't be done. And at that point, that's where I was like, okay, I'm no longer receptive, and I left the meeting, and I chose to leave the meeting because I was no longer being receptive to the information, and I was really disappointed because even if I had joined the coalition to express concerns and prior disagreement, I still came in a spirit of collaboration and hope of receiving tools and useful information and moving forward, and I just really felt that wasn't achieved. And like Chuck, I went home and asked myself, what is it that we're doing here? And what am I doing here in my evenings? Why am I spending my time here? But continue to show up, right? I continue to have hope, and I continue to believe that the work is worth it and that we're gonna make it through, even if it is long and rocky, that if we continue to work together, it can be done.
Thank you.
I'll just add one more thing about the California law, because Jacob isn't here tonight, but he actually talked to him afterwards and he put in his email that the man did admit he was attacking California laws. And what's so odd is the stipulated judgment is based on California laws. And to me, I'd say if you look at the judgment, it's a little bit progressive, because it talks about bias training and community policing and letting critics talk to you, and so I think to see that absolutely against it, and he admitted it. He that he was privately, but again, we didn't get to question it, and that was part of my frustration.
Did we run out of time, and that's why you couldn't question it?
Well, I did question him for a moment, yeah, because it was a meeting, we already had a 3-hour meeting, so, I mean, we could have stayed longer, but I think a lot of people were tired of this. But anyway, I mean, it was just, I think it was, that was part of your letter, said you'll have a chance to ask him questions. And
Yeah.
oddly enough, I don't know if you know it, but you accidentally sent out the same email again this month, so I freaked out thinking he was coming back. It was left in Babette's letter.
The what?
The heading was still in there, you can ask him what he's talking about, and I go, oh my God. So, I mean.
The agenda?
On the agenda.
Just a
But
typo.
Rosa reassured me it wasn't happening. But I'm just saying, it was that intense that to feel attacked, and to feel like this man is against us, and he's, everything we're doing, the DOJ is wrong, the stipulated judgment is wrong, and what are we doing here? But that is what we're doing here, and we're not giving up.
Agreed. Anyone else?
Yeah, I can share. I think it was educational in understanding kind of the challenges and difficulties of what officers have to go through when using use of force and making the decision. So I think on that aspect, he shared helpful information into seeing that perspective. I do think he was biased. I think he admitted at one point that he was biased against progressive policies and California policies. I think for me, what I'd like to see to kind of like counteract that bias that he kind of shared and was against would be another presenter that was sharing, again, the tools and opportunities to implement some of these policies that California is pursuing and that is in the stipulated judgment, just to get both perspectives so we can really see like a balanced perspective of it. Obviously, we had one speaker that was biased, and so I think that could help me get a clearer view of use of force and how we can really make the best use of this space is to have a speaker that could counteract it and maybe get input from the group on choosing a speaker to help balance those biases that are present.
Yeah, I definitely will provide those opportunities for you guys to have input. Better than I did before. So I guess was non-existent. Chuck?
I would love to hear from some of the police officers who attended that presentation and how they felt about it.
Okay.
I'll share. It was interesting for me to listen to I've never listened to Mr. Klein before, and it was the first opportunity I had to hear what he was going to say. And as being a person who's assigned to work directly for Chief Terry, doing specific things related to community engagement, and many of you know me in that space, however you interpreted what he said, whether it be that, community policing isn't even necessary type thing, if you look at what the track record and what BPD is continually doing with our focus and intentionality towards community engagement, that was obviously opposite of what he said, right? And so Chief Terry, when he talked about even in his letter about being, that this is just used as a person's perspective or an opinion, but with many experts, we take certain things and other things we don't. So I think if you look at how we operate as an organization and the work that we have been doing and will continue to do, a lot of that was different than some of the things that he said, because some of the things he said I didn't necessarily agree with. I think there were a lot of things that were informational as related to reaction times and officers' perceptions of incidents and those types of things, which I felt in my experience as police officer were accurate, but some of the things were a little bit different. And it was kind of interesting to hear it because I think we operate differently, and hopefully you'll see as our proposed policy starts getting presented is that we are going to take certain things that he said and probably show that we don't agree with him. We're going down this route because that's what we committed to, and the stipulated agreement mentions it, so we're going to do it. It's a short little bit on my perspective.
Anyone else?
I would agree with Ryan. I think initially the whole idea was to come in and kind of provide general overarching views of use of force in general, but not necessarily to speak on behalf of the department or speak to the stipulated judgment as well. The task that the police department have and this group specifically is very challenging. It's a very difficult task, and I don't think
difference. What he showed was so many incidents in which, of unpredictability. You're faced with so many situations where you don't know what the outcome is gonna be, so you have to be ever vigilant, ever aware. But if you have that perspective of the community, how do you interact with them if they're all posing a threat to you? Because I think that was a strong message that he portrayed throughout the training, is that every contact that you have with a person could present a deadly situation. And so you have to always be mindful and so aware of that. And we don't want you ever to be ever injured. And so how do you balance that ever-present threat? The next person you have contact with could kill you, as he showed within seconds, with the same thing that you have to engage with the community, and we have to build a relationship. So it seems, based on his training, that's a real hard thing for you guys to get to. And how do we get there? And how do we help you get there? Is kind of my question. And I'm sure that's what we're going to be working on as far as the use of force. But that was what I came away with, is how we balance those two opposing things. We want you guys to feel more comfortable with the community, but every community member, according to him, was the potential threat of death.
Yes, that's the challenge. It's absolutely a challenge that we have every day in our community, because I know me personally, and I think everybody that comes to our department, they're drawn to law enforcement because they want to help serve the community. They want to be of service, and they want to go out there and be helpful. I don't think anybody signs up for this job to be a problem, or to be a challenge. But that is exactly the challenge. The ambiguous nature of what we do out there is difficult. It's not a type of profession where there is always a clear roadmap of what you have to go. It is evaluating what's out there and taking the information and trying to apply it in a manner that is safe for everyone that's involved, as safe as we possibly can be in a situation that is on every call is ultimately unknown. You have hopefully ideas of what to expect, usually in a general idea, but the specifics and the ever-evolving nature of each of those calls, what you think you're going into may be completely different. And so I don't know how to answer your question specifically, because I don't know that there is a clear answer other than knowing that while we have to be aware and have practices that give us the best possible opportunity to be safe in a situation, we also understand that most people in our community are not a threat to us, and that we're out there looking to serve them specifically. So it's walking that fine line and navigating that challenge of understanding that threats are out there and they're real, and we have to be vigilant for them, but we can't lose sight of what our specific mission is, which is to serve them.
Without getting us too far off track, because I want to stick with what we need to accomplish this, because there's going to be a lot of opportunities for these kinds of conversations. But does somebody want to her point, or to her question specifically, directly, how do we begin, or how do we have the conversation with officers in training with that recognition to be prepared, to be protective, but to engage and to be personable and recognize that we are here to serve the community? What does, briefly, because again, there's going to be a lot of opportunities for these conversations, but briefly, what does that conversation look like or sound like when we are training officers on this? One of you guys want to weigh in?
I think that it's, I think that the answer to your question is we address it in training. Like that's how we address, how do we recognize when somebody's a threat? We train officers on recognizing those threat indicators. We play videos for them, real life scenarios of where a person in the community spontaneously attacks an officer. And whenever we look at it from hindsight of 2020, which granted the officer didn't have at the time, but looking at it from that lens, you get to see some of the indicators beforehand. Maybe the officer might have picked up on that, they've been properly trained on it. They see that the guy's looking around, and he's cracking his knuckles, and he's getting some of those non-verbal cues that a trained officer might be able to recognize, and then start creating distance and getting additional resources there and working towards a more peaceful response. But that's unfortunately, it's a luxury we don't have. In special forces in the military, they'll train 3 times times as many hours as they anticipate it'll take for one mission. And we're not granted with that ability to train that much. I wish we could. I wish we could train every single officer 3 days for every 1 day that they weren't on patrol or on the streets. And I guarantee there'd be a huge difference you'd see in law enforcement in the community and how it works. But we're not granted that luxury. It's hard enough for us to get qualified people as it is to do this job. But we're committed to the training, the quality of the training that we are putting together. A lot of it's scenario-based. A lot of it's, cutting edge of best practices in the industry. So we're constantly looking for new ideas. And I hear your complaints about, this one presenter and the focus that was driven from that. And that's just one small piece of the entire, training and subject matter expert pie that we use as that we pull from. So that's not just like one thing that we do. We train these officers as best we can, but I mean, that's the answer to your question in short term is we train them to hopefully see those responses and try and mitigate those threats.
To add to Chief Terry's question, it starts day one in the police academy. Well, actually starts before that when we have volunteer sessions of having our future employees coming out and doing physical training. There are normal conversations that occur. It's not generally a military-based training camp, if you will. In the academy, we teach them soft skills, we teach them communication, we teach them how to be tactically sound, we can teach them how to engage a threat, how to respond to a threat, and how to deal with a threat. Post-academy, during the mini academy, there's additional training that occurs there, additional engagement with our employees at the department. Where really, I think the hands-on training comes during the field training officer phase, where they're out there working with people in our organization that we hand select through a selection process to be field training officers, so that they can watch someone else speak to a community member, engage a community member, make a situation safe, and learn, and learn by doing, learn by watching, learn by modeling and demonstrating how to knock on the door, something as simple as knock on someone's door and say, hey, I'm here because you called, and engage them and talk to them. That comes from repetition, 10 hours a day, 40 hours a week, if not 50 hours a week, of having to work with the community, help the community, and make things safe, conduct investigations, and all of that comes with OJT, if you will, a lot of it does. And supported by that are our guiding values, treating people with compassion, being accountable for our actions, and being professionals in how we treat people. Bottom line, customer service. What can we do to help you? So all of that is instilled in our people from day one all the way through until they out on their own. The first day they go get in the car and they push the button that they're in service and they go out there and start responding to calls. Then it all kind of comes full circle and it's up to them to respond and remember the training that they were provided. Additionally, most of our calls for service, there's more than one officer that responds. It's usually two. So additional modeling, additional watch someone else doing it occurs there as well. And it's up to each officer. They're human beings, just like all of us sitting in this room, to absorb and respond accordingly based on our policy, based on law, based on the culture of the organization, based on our guiding values and our mission to partner with the community, protect the lives of people properly serve. And that's where it all comes from. And on top of that, additional training that we have, every 2 years, advanced officer training. A lot of the stuff we're going to talk about in these use of force presentations, that I think it'll help give a little full circle as to how we get from point A to B, C, or what have you.
I mean, it's just psychologically, like the officer over here said, be human to help people. And then if we're constantly being told that the community's not, going to attack you, I mean, psychologically, that's got to be difficult to deal with on a daily basis. I focus on psychology. But for you officers, that was another thing that came away from
Yeah,
right now, but I'm
we'll
just.
be able to provide, as your research and as the conversations continue on the use of force specifically, we'll be able to provide you some of that.
Balance.
Yeah, because, well, before I comment, is there anybody else that wants to say anything?
I just have one more question about the training. Do you train them that it's okay to walk up to community members? Like, I was at events and they wouldn't come speak to us, they ignored it. My man was wonderful, we had one, can't think of his name now, but Vaughn, Sergeant Vaughn maybe. Yes, he came and, hello, it was a great day, but most of the time they would huddle by themselves. And the other time, I live in a gated community, and a couple months ago, there was an officer trying to get, I could see he didn't know if he could get in the gate, but I could drive close enough in the daytime it opened, so I waved him to come in. When he drove in, I'm trying to wave at him and say hello, he would not look at me. I mean, are you trained not to look at people?
No.
Go train just the opposite.
Very odd, because, it's like, and I think Chuck, a lot of times they drive in cars, I mean, maybe they're afraid to look at people when they're driving in their cars. I don't know, it was just a very weird experience. I was
Okay.
trying to help them in it.
Yeah.
And we've talked about that.
Thank you for that.
In our monthly meetings about, it's good to understand the pressures of an officer, because oftentimes you may think they're not watching you or they don't want to wave to you or make eye contact with you, but maybe they're looking at their computer trying to get information, and being in a patrol car and doing a ride along and seeing some of the things that take place in the, things that officers have to do to make sure that they have all the information they can sometimes negate them maybe making eye contact, but they're actually getting the opposite of.
I just waved at him. It was a little weird, but you're right, in general.
Yeah, it's good to understand the perspective, but we teach our officers, look at the community, talk to them, you're part of them. You'll hear a lot of terms throughout these presentations on sanctity of life and treating people on the heartbeat of the human being, how important that is in what we do in every aspect of the job. But sometimes,
Yes.
Sorry, just really quickly, just circling back to the conversation that we were having about FSI and the presenter that came in last night. I think when we had asked for a presenter, we were really hoping to have someone who could speak to AB 392, SB 230, some of these laws that impact the policies that we're going to be reviewing, as well as really understand what the terms of the stipulated judgment have, right? Because that's what we're tasked with, and unfortunately, that's not the type of presentation that we got. I think we've already heard from some of my fellow members about, some of the reactions to it on both sides. But I just, I think it's important as we move forward to really have someone to come in and speak to us to better understand AB 392 or some of these terms like seem to be for life, because we're tasked with reviewing these policies, and not everyone really, some of these terms or these like standards are really hard to wrap your mind around, and so it's just really important to lay that foundation for all CAP members so that we have that as we engage in conversations together on how to revise these policies. So just wanted to reemphasize that.
Okay, thank you.
I just have
Oh, yes.
one of the things that I least appreciated about his videos was that so many of the perpetrators were big black men, and also in the clip where the man said, "I can't breathe." Absolutely true. I mean, I'm sure that line gets overused. But to me, that was a cynical attack on Black Lives Matter. To me, that was a shot that cheapened the presentation and added nothing to it. You all know that people will use that line. But it has become a political slogan for Black Lives Matter, and to use it in a professional presentation, to me, smacks of racism.
Okay. Well, thank you all for your feedback. I sincerely mean that, and I hear you. And as I said when I responded to all of you in the email, that when we talk about future presenters. I do think, Stephanie, to your point, that it should be relevant and purposed and focused, and that it should be intentional about what it is that this speaker is going to talk to us about. That is what I intended this to be. I did not intend for this speaker for it to be personal to us, to the police department, but that it would provide an overview of force-related issues and the complexities and the challenges of that, just in a broad perspective. For those of you that found some of it helpful, then I'm grateful for that or glad to hear that. And for those of you that didn't, that is not what I intended. And by no means was the fact that we moved forward after hearing from you, I was not purposing to be dismissive of your opinions or your perspective at all, whatsoever. We do have difficult responsibilities trying to provide for the training of the department and the officers to ensure that officers are acting professionally within the law and all of those things that all of us expect from a police officer. And I think generally there's great commonality in what we expect and what we want from police officers. And so we have purpose and will continue to be a leading edge type organization that looks for the best training, the best skills, the emerging practices, so that we can start doing it, certain things. Emerging practices so that we stop doing certain things. And expanding our use of technology and the whole of what we know about the brain, what we know about emotions, and we know all of those kinds of things. We're going to continue to look for as broad a research pool as we can. Clearly, as you look at our draft use of force policy, you're going to find blatant, obvious inconsistencies with what he said and what our proposed policy is. That's not an accident. That's because we intend it to be that way. We are committed, and we will follow the law. We are committed to fulfilling the stipulated judgment and the elements of it. In addition to that, ensuring that our policies align with our own values and what our community's expectations are. And that is what your role is, to help be the voice for the community and to provide us input on that. And so that is where we are going. That is my commitment to you, and certainly want any future speakers to fit exactly what you have described tonight, to make it relevant, to make it focused, to make it purposeful on the work that we are all doing together, to help us make informed decisions. I do expect, and it is a priority for us, that as officers go out and work into the community, that the community have some confidence in what the officers are being trained to do, and that we can be a source of help and not fear. And I recognize that exists in a lot of different ways in different parts of our community. We will continue our work to do that. And so as long as I sit in the chair that I sit in, that is where we're going to go as an organization. And so I'm always open to hearing your feedback. I'm grateful for your feedback. Your input just on this topic has generated lots of conversations internally about training selection, about purpose, and about what are we doing and what is the priority, who is the messenger, a variety of those kinds of things. And so I have heard you, and we are listening to your input. So that is where we are, and that's where we're going. So I appreciate all of your feedback sincerely, and I look forward to continuing to work with you. Please continue to engage with us. Continue to do this work. I'll skip ahead just a bit for talk about our facilitator, our project manager. We had our request for proposals to have a project management firm or a service to contract to come in and facilitate the meetings and add a great deal of professionalism, structure, and a whole host of things like that to the work that we've been doing, because we have kind of struggled over the last year to find our way, because none of us have done this work before. And I do not want to be disrespectful or misuse your time and commitment to this. And we've wasted a lot of time, in my view, as well, and I know many of you feel the same way, in a variety of different ways. And so I'm very optimistic that this is going to provide some stability and structure and allow us to move forward in a much greater way. It is going to help us. We do have some work to do with making sure that we are adhering to the policy and reconciling some of that work to ensure that we are procedurally operating the way that we intend to operate. And I'm optimistic that this group is going to bring that back to us as well. We have a board. How many people, Ryan, are those raters? There are 3. So we've given all the proposals to some raters to grade the proposals. That feedback is going to be given to Ryan, I think, tomorrow. So we intend to execute an agreement and have them, ideally, here for our January meeting, so that we can move forward. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Chief. I appreciate that. In terms of organizational structure for our meeting, I do have something that's been a concern of
Okay.
mine for quite some time, and I think this is a good transition as you're talking about bringing in someone to facilitate and to bring some type of organization to how we communicate and how we adhere to the stipulation agreement. Deciding to be on this panel came with applying, an application process, which was reviewed, accepted. I need a point of clarification on what does that look like in terms of who is on this panel, who's an alternate, what is the definition of being an alternate? I see organizations being represented by 3 or 4 members, some 2, where the alternate is also here. I'm just really confused on the organizational structure of this panel. Oftentimes when you have more than one representation from an organization present, it yields a bias in terms of you've got more people to agree with you because you have a collective. So I think that needs to be addressed. I'm frustrated by it completely. I need to know who's on the panel, who's not on the panel, who's an alternate, and what does that look like? Do they attend as an alternate? What is the definition? We just need clarity. I feel there's a lot of hidden agendas around here, and it's gone too far.
Okay. I'll answer yours, and then we'll move on if there are some more. The policy states, and we do, and you're correct that there was an application process. It was reviewed by the city manager, and then we had identified 18 to 23 members, initial members. Each of there are named groups in the stipulated judgment, and each one of them was automatically provided a position among the group, the larger cap. The policy states, and it is our intention that it be one representative from each of those groups. It was also, as it got into conversations about how long people would serve, that there was an agreement, an acknowledgement from my perspective, actually from me directly, was that depending on the topics, the representative from the named groups might change from time to time, given on their organizational assignment for them, or perhaps the topic that was relevant for that. Members of the CAP can have an alternate that can appear for them when they are not here. That is the intent. It is stated in the policy, and I think I'd have to go back and look at the recording, but I'm pretty sure that we had conversations in some of those early meetings that I was going to defer to the members of the CAP to find an alternate when they couldn't appear for the meeting, but that by their selection, they would affirm that whoever they identified or who would appear as their alternate was eligible for membership based on the policy, the CAP policy. I'm not sure that we're there in some respects in terms of the alternates and whether or not they fit or are eligible for membership as defined by the policy. Obviously, there are, and routinely and have been, multiple members from some of the organizations. We've begun some conversations with them to try to provide some clarity and focus of that. But it is our intent to be, to honor the policy and be faithful to what it was intended and the structure. And so that's why I think you raised a couple of examples. I think that there are probably a couple of others that as we bring this firm on, that's going to be reconciled. That's my intent, is that part of the purpose of this group or this service will be to reconcile that and hold us accountable to the defined policy and ensure that we operate procedurally in the correct way. So,
Yeah, I'm hoping so too, because I'm seeing alternates here as well as the primary representatives. So
yeah.
there's confusion, we're off subject, we can't get anything done, it little subcommittees and coalitions, and hopefully this person can reconcile that. I really think that a lot of our problems is coming from having too many representatives from one organization.
Can I just clarify that it's not more than two for organizations that I've seen. I know that some of the main active member organizations, I've only seen two. So I don't know which organization has brought 3 or 4. None that I've seen, and I've really been in most meetings.
But should it be only one and the alternate?
No,
stay on?
so just to clarify, because I also would like to go back to the meeting notes. I think in the first few meetings, I think what we discussed was that yes, we will have 1 member and 1 alternate, but I think that the concern was, if, you know, how do we, the continuity, how do we, yes,
Yeah.
that term. And so I think it's like either do we check in or are they allowed to just sit in some of the meetings where they don't have a vote? But just so they're, you know, if at any time someone was to step away for 1, 2, 3 months, they knew what was going on, didn't have to like come in and catch up and disrupt the conversation. So my recollection, and I'll go back to the notes because I also take notes, is we agree like, okay, that's, you know, they can sit in as an alternate and they didn't have a vote. And so I'm a little confused as to why we're bringing this back when we agreed to 1 member, 1 alternate, and that it was to the discretion of how do we ensure that they are on top of the conversation and that when they come actually step in as a member, that there's no disruption because they need to be caught up.
Yeah, we'll go back and
I'm confused.
Yeah, so
we'll go back and listen to the recording because
Please.
we've recorded all of them. But I do remember a similar conversation. I don't remember it that way because I remember because the policy dictates, and I remember in the way that we say it. I remember saying it as we were talking about it, that I was going to rely on you as a CAP member, that whoever you found as a replacement for you, that you would inform them, that they would come prepared, and that they were eligible for membership. And I was going to defer to you to do that. We'll go back and revisit the recording. I think it was either the first or the second meeting when we had a bunch of those conversations. But again, I want to approach this collaboratively, and I want to approach this that here's what my intent is that the policy as drafted is going to be followed, that as the groups, the named groups need to transition and reassign, or however that might need to happen, we'll make room for that. But that there is the intent that 1 member represent the group, and that if you are not there, that named member, you can have somebody come. But it will be your responsibility to make sure that there is continuity in that. But we'll go back, because I am curious now that you've raised that specific point, if that was in fact the case. So we'll go back and visit that. Yes?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if you're done, are we done with that? I want to go back to your hiring someone, and I have a question about that.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
I will say one thing about that, though. I felt a little bit attacked when she said biased, as though some groups are biased, which I just don't think that everybody has a different opinion.
And that's how I felt.
Well,
That's how I
just to use
felt.
that word was a little weird.
It's my
But anyway,
opinion.
back to the other one. Can there be any cap input on what we would like in that person? And if there is, how would we let Brian know? Or something?
Can there be
Just
cap input on
just
what?
Just like things we would like that person to know about and do. You probably already know them, but just like we want someone who will not ever, who will make sure that nobody gets interrupted. I don't know. I'm just
Are you
saying.
talking about the
yeah,
facilitator?
Yeah, for the facilitator.
Oh, yeah. No, I absolutely what I absolutely want your input of
Yeah.
what are some of the behaviors, traits, skills that you think it would be important for us as we evaluate these proposals. Feel free to provide those to me, to Ryan, to Babette, whoever, of the skills that you think it's important that this facilitator project manager have. 100%. I would ask all of you to, if you have input on that or advice, then absolutely say it.
All right, thank you.
Sure. Okay. Anything else that we need to discuss that has already been planned to, or Stephanie or Ryan, or we're going to move on to the overview that Sergeant Bishop's going to do? So Sergeant Bishop is prepared to, again, revisit a little bit. You have our draft policy. We've had some discussions already. He's going to provide a very brief overview of just revisit some definitions, and then he's going to revisit some specific areas in our policy and going to really contrast what our current policy is and what the proposed policy is on several different areas of the department, or several different areas in the use of force policy. Definitions, probably some guiding values stuff, tell you specifically what some of the policy changes will be or have been. Am I missing anything else in terms of this presentation? Okay. And then I know Stephanie and Ryan had talked about a couple of other brief conversation points regarding the simulator and regarding some subgroups. And so think about that as he moves through his presentation, and that's how we'll conclude the meeting. Okay. You need some roaming space, Sergeant Bishop? You need to move the tables? That's right.
You want to give them a couple minutes, Chief?
Yeah. Yeah, let's try to come back in like 5 minutes so we can get out on time.
So the agenda for tonight, what we'll do is we're going to start off. I know that there were some concerns about some definitions, what things mean. So we're going to go through a couple of the definitions that we have to the bulk of it, which is really this comparison of our current policy as it stands today versus the revised policy that you all have been given a copy of, and how those changes work to meet the stipulated judgment. At the very end of it, we'll talk about reasonableness of force, some of the factors that are considered whenever determining if force is reasonable or not, and then we'll leave a little bit of time for you guys at the end, and we'll ask some questions. So, a couple of definitions. So, at the beginning of this, some people were curious, what is force? We're talking about using force. What is the use of force? So, the way that it's defined in the new policy is the application of physical techniques or tactics, chemical agents, or weapons on another person to gain compliance or defend officers or others from harm. It's not a use of force when someone allows themselves to be searched or handcuffed, or if a person sustains injury without an effort by the officer. So that might be an example, an officer chasing someone, the person falls down, they get injured, but the officer doesn't actually use any force on them. That wouldn't be a use of force. Deadly force is pretty much defined through Penal Code 835A and Government Code 7286. You'll hear the word feasible, right? So you might wonder, what does feasible mean? Feasible means reasonably capable of being done or carried out under the circumstances to successfully achieve the arrest or lawful objective without increasing the risk to the officer or another person. Imminent threat. Imminent threat is a threat of death or serious bodily injury that is imminent when, based on the totality of the circumstances, a reasonable officer in the same situation would believe that a person has the present ability, opportunity, and apparent intent to immediately cause death or serious bodily injury to the peace officer or another person. And then it explains through a little bit more. And it's also, again, defined in Penal Code 835A. And then objectively reasonable force is defined here. An objective standard of force viewed from the perspective of a reasonable officer to determine whether the force used was reasonable under the totality of the circumstances known to or reasonably believed by the officer at the time force was used. And that's without the hindsight of 2020 like we were talking about before. So what does serious bodily injury mean? Serious bodily injury is defined in Penal Code 243-4. So this is the definition that we use in the policy. It's any severe impairment of physical condition, including but not limited to loss of consciousness, concussion, bone fracture, protracted loss or impairment of the function of any bodily member or organ, or a wound requiring extensive suturing or any severe disfigurement. That's the definition of serious bodily injury as it stands in the penal code. Totality of the circumstances, another term that you guys will hear frequently and see frequently through this policy. And that just means it's all facts known to the officer at the time, including the officer's conduct and that of the subject leading up to the use of force, up to and including deadly force. And again, that one's also defined in Penal Code 835. So some of the things that are not clearly identified are the word necessary and the word reasonable. You'll see these words all throughout these policies that you get to review. So here's some definitions from Webster's Dictionary and Oxford Language on what necessary means: absolutely needed or required, required to be done, achieved, or essential. Same thing for reasonable. Also not specifically defined in a lot of the California laws that you'll see in a lot of this stuff in the policy. So what does reasonable mean? Being in accordance with reason, not extreme or excessive, moderate or fair, having sound judgment, fair and reasonable. So these are some of the values that we're going to look at in the comparison of the current policy as it stands and the new policy that's being proposed. Starting off the current policy, this is what it says about the values of our current policy right now. It has the chief's guiding values: compassion, accountability, and professionalism. And it also goes into the Law Enforcement Code of Ethics, which is, it goes into a lot of different details. Every law enforcement officer knows the Law Enforcement Code of Ethics by heart, memorized by the time they graduate the academy. Now we've revised this to meet the stipulated agreement, so we've changed the values of our policy. So when you look at our new policy and you focus on the values, you're going to see things like sanctity of human life. That's number one. That is the highest regard that we have, the highest value that we have at the Bakersfield Police Department when it comes to use of force. We want to make sure every time that we use force or everything that we do, we're showing respect and dignity and trying to preserve life as much as we can. Here's the part where it talks about employing force in a bias-free manner. No force can be employed against anyone because of their race, religion, sexual orientation, housing status, disability, any of that. So that's clearly defined as a bias-free policing and use of force, and there's also a whole separate section for bias-free policing. Continuing on into the values. Community trust and legitimacy. We know that excessive use of force or an ugly use of force harms the relationship between the Bakersfield Police Department or any law enforcement agency and the community. And we understand that even a lawful use of force might damage that relationship because all the factors might not be known to the community. It might just come out, that last 5 seconds of a video and it looks really, really bad, but they don't get the full context of the full, minute that happened before that leading up to everything and what the officers may have had to do and they had no other choice. So we understand that even lawful and proper use of force can damage that relationship. So we're lining out factors for officers to follow, explaining things to people whenever they have a use of force, trying to de-escalate and talk to them afterwards, talking to family members, talking to community members that might see what happened during use of force, just to try and repair those potential for damaged relationships. Reduction of harm, this kind of goes in line with the preservation of human life. We want to make sure that even during and after a use of force that we're doing everything we can to reduce harm, use as little force as we possibly can, and then also to provide aid after a use of force incident does occur. So some of the policy changes about de-escalation. Current policy as it stands, there's no specific section on de-escalation. It is mentioned a few times, like I've highlighted here, alternative actions that we use for de-escalation. But here, in the new policy, we've made it a focal point where officers have a duty to de-escalate before using force, when feasible, right? So we've added a lot more language on what an officer should be looking at in every contact, how they can be de-escalating things in order to avoid having to use force. So these are some of the techniques that we line out, right? So verifying information from the dispatcher, trying to communicate with the suspect, gathering resources, like seeing if the mental health evaluation team's available, seeing if there's other tools available other than just one or two that the officer might be assigned with. They might see if there's other lower levels of force that are available throughout the city. As we get into the force levels, like you can see there's like a little toolkit of things up here. So we'll show you some of these different tools and options that an officer might have available to them that they might request to try and get something to de-escalate before having to use higher levels of force. Proportionality, this is another term that was coined during the stipulated judgment and all the law changes prior to these things that have happened. So current policy, the only thing that it mentions as far as proportionality or anything proportional is it just talks about this definition right here. Is officers may only use levels of force that they reasonably believe to be proportional or to the seriousness of the suspected offense or reasonably perceived level of actual or threatened resistance. And that's consistent with what proportionality is. So we have that variation in the current policy, but here we clearly define what proportionality is. And it goes along and digs further into that definition of how the level of the offense and the force that's used needs to be balanced out. And as well as the level of threat that the suspect might pose to the officer needs to be balanced with the amount of force that is used by the officer. So it's basically, when you think of proportionality, think of those weights on the scale. Okay, does the threat by the suspect balance out the amount of force that the officer is using? As well as the level of the offense, right? Is this a murder suspect where it might be a little bit more serious? Or is this someone that's just, shoplifting? These are the things that we want an officer to consider when we talk about proportionality. So we made a lot of changes to our policy as far as it goes to the duty to intercede, what happens when an officer fails to intercede, as well as encounters with vulnerable populations and some of the prohibitions that are lined out in the use of force. So duty to intercede, current policy as it stands does address the duty to intercede. It's lined out in Government Code 7286. Talks about excessive force and talks about the failure to intercede if an officer fails to act or intercede whenever they perceive some clearly excessive force. In the new policy, we've expanded on that even more. We've broken it up a little bit and added more language and more information into what an officer is required to do, especially as it comes to reporting excessive force and the notification to supervisors. And towards the end of this, we'll talk a little bit more in detail about supervisor responsibilities and what they have to do whenever it comes to use of force or any reported excessive force. Vulnerable populations. The current policy has a little bit of information in there, and it mostly comes into the training that we provide to officers on how to deal with people in vulnerable populations. But in the new policy, it's much more established, lining out what vulnerable populations are, children under the age of 18, elderly persons, pregnant women, people with physical or mental health disabilities, as well as people with limited English proficiency or just difficulty communicating, like people who are hard of hearing or have other disabilities that might affect that. So these are the vulnerable populations, and it's addressed in policy, and it's well addressed in training how we're going to teach officers and train them to deal with these things.
Is that just a misspelling or is that something new?
What?
Populations, what is that? At the top, vulnerable? Is this, okay.
Populations?
I'm not trying to, I just didn't know that was a new term.
Yeah, I'm not super educated, so I
It was a new term.
there might be some spelling errors in here. And I'll give you the caveat that leading up to this,
I'm sorry.
leading up to this, plans were a little bit different and plans changed. So I mean, we were having plans to
Okay.
put the simulator together and apply your guys' use in the simulator to our use of force policy. So things are changing. So if there's spelling errors, it's just because I took care of this real quick. So prohibitions, our current policy, some of the restrictions, right? So the law changed a couple years ago where carotid restraints or chokeholds or anything that compresses a person's neck or their ability to breathe was outlawed in the state of California. So that was immediately adopted into our policies. So that's expanded upon in prohibitions, as well as a couple other things that we're prohibiting officers from doing. Obviously, anything that relates to excessive force, using force to seize evidence whenever a suspect might swallow paraphernalia or drugs or something of that sort. So that's expanded upon a little bit in the prohibitions. Again, just clearly lining out that prohibited use of any neck restraints. So that's a carotid restraint, that's a chokehold, that's anything that restricts the blood flow or the airflow through a person's windpipe or anything to their brain. That's fully restricted in our policies. So here is where we're going to dive into some of what I think is more interesting part of it, is it talks a lot about when officers can use force. This is a big thing in the stipulated judgment, is when can an officer use force, when can't they use force? So the way this is broken down is through these different levels of resistance that a suspect may provide. And it's either going to be compliance, which isn't even up here because there's no time where a suspect complies that force should be used. But there's passive noncompliance, there's active resistance, assaultive behaviors, or anything that's life-threatening. So current policy, there's some mention of levels of resistance, but again, it's not clearly lined out. The new policy clearly has it explained what is passive resistance, what is active resistance, what is assaultive behavior, and what's life-threatening. Whenever we talk about passive noncompliance, the description we like to give is think about the peaceful protesters that are the environmentalists, and they're standing singing Kumbaya with their hands around the tree that they don't want cut down. Officers show up, they're trying to explain to them, hey, you can't be here, you're being trespassed, you're breaking the law, whatever it may be, and they're just refusing to even acknowledge the officer's presence. They're singing Kumbaya, they're not even acknowledging the officers are there. That's basically a definition of, or an example of passive noncompliance. Active resistance can mean a lot of different things. It can mean running away, it could mean someone tensing up the muscles in their arms, that could be active resistance. It could be them doing things that they want to try and avoid apprehension or prevent escape. It's any physical activity or verbal threat to not comply. Assaultive behavior is pretty straightforward. Anything that is a threat against the officer or the public. Anything that could be viewed as assaultive. And then life-threatening, that's going to be classified with, in the deadly force policy, as anything that is an imminent threat to death or serious bodily injury to an officer or the public. So these are the force levels that are broken down into when officers can use these different levels of force. Minimal force is basically anything that is not going to cause a complaint of pain or injury, or it's just a show of force. So pointing a gun at someone, presenting a firearm is a level 1 minimal force. Having a taser out. And with a taser, so if you guys aren't familiar with these tasers, and there's no cartridges in here, so don't worry, but with these tasers, they have the ability to create an arc. And all that does is it's going to create a loud electrical charge across the front of the taser that's just a form of showing force. So doing that would be a minimal level 1 use of force, because it's a show of force, that force may be to come. Controlling force, this is force that's not intended to cause injury. And again, remember, we don't judge these or evaluate these 100% based on the outcome. This is the intention of the officer to use these levels of force and how they can justify it with what they perceive at the time. So controlling force could be taking someone to the ground, pushing somebody, using their body weight, or using certain controls to overcome someone's resistance or get them into custody. Level 3, intermediate force. These are a lot of these things on the counter, right? So intermediate force would be the use of a taser against somebody. The use of pepper spray. Okay, these are things that every officer at the Vicksburg Police Department is assigned. The use of an impact weapon like a baton. Okay? Inside the bag here is, these aren't assigned to every officer, but this is what's called a less lethal munition launcher. So what these do is they fire a sponge round. So an officer could load in a round into here, and it's just like a thick, spongy material that they can use from a distance that is injuring force. It has the likelihood to cause injury lesser than deadly force, but in order to use these things, the officer has to be met with assaultive behavior. So go back a slide or two to the levels of resistance. So right here, passive noncompliance, active resistance. Officers cannot use these tools against these people until they get to the point where they pose some type of a threat or some type of assaultive behavior towards the officer or the public. And then, so level 4 is the highest level, and that's a deadly force. In most circumstances, 90% of the time, we're going to be talking about firearms, an officer discharging a firearm in this case. But if there is a circumstance that an officer maybe unintentionally hits a suspect in the head with a baton, or an officer uses a vehicle against a suspect for vehicle intervention, that may be classified as a deadly force situation. So current policy on use of force levels 1 and 2 is explained here basically just in how Penal Code 835A is described. So we've broken these down into the different levels. Level 1, minimal force, what it consists of, arcing of the taser, pointing a firearm at someone, and level 2, controlling force. Like I said, it's things that are not intended to cause injury. Level 3, like we talked about, are all these levels, or all these types of force that could result in injury. Right? Doesn't mean that they always result in injury, but they have the potential to cause injury. So these are all classified in a higher level of government interest, and so these have to be met with a higher threat towards the officer of the public. And deadly force level 4 is how it's classified, the highest level of force that is available to officers. It is described in the deadly force applications policy that we currently have, but again, it's expanded upon further here. Everything that we have in here is language that is supposed to be consistent with the stipulated judgment. Most of it is pulled from Penal Code 835A and Government Code 7286. This is just continuing on how much further it explains deadly force applications in the current, or the proposed policy. Another one of the changes that was made is pointing firearms at people. So there is some language in our current policy on displaying firearms and what that means, but as it stands right now, it's not classified as a reportable use of force. The only thing that we are doing differently that I will tell you is when a use of force does occur, if there's a pointing of a firearm that takes place, that is documented right now today. So if officers get involved in a use of force with someone, they end up tasing him. Prior to tasing him, they had their firearm displayed at him while they're trying to negotiate. That pointing of a firearm is going to be documented in a use of force report by the supervisor, as well as the taser deployment. But standalone pointing of firearms, this is waiting until the policy goes live with officers. So once it gets through all of you, then we're going to start reporting that as a minimal use of force. So supervisor responsibility. This is where we spent a lot of work on what supervisors are required to do and their response to every use of force. So there is some language in the current policy on what a supervisor's responsibility is and how they're supposed to respond to use of force. Now it's more expanded upon, and there's more expected of the supervisors whenever it comes to anything that relates to excessive force and anything that relates to deficiencies in training. There's the entire use of force working group that our department has that consists of subject matter experts that will review about a dozen or so use of force cases every single month involving officers from within the department. So part of that is communicating with supervisors. If a supervisor gets called out to use of force, they identify that, yeah, this officer, they were kind of lacking on their tactics. Like they should have got this person into custody using lower levels of force, or they should have maintained control of this person better, and then eventually led to a second use of force. These things happen. I mean, every officer that we have employed here is a human being, and like I explained, there are not enough training hours that we would like to provide to every single officer. So we give ourselves opportunities to identify where deficiencies might take place and provide further training to the officers. So this is an example. Have you guys seen these? Did they show these to you guys with the canine policy at all? This is an example of the blue team system. This is what supervisors use to input all of the use of force reports and data. So this is what a sergeant sees whenever they go to enter in a use of force. So they have their face page, and they're entering all these different categories here. Where the offense occurs, a summary of the use of force, all the use of force details, incident links involving every officer and every citizen that's involved in the use of force. That includes witness officers and witness civilians that get documented in that. And then any actions that the supervisor recommends. So that could be if they recommended training for the officers, or if they just wrote it up and forwarded it to the supervisor. From there, from the officer inputting it into Blue Team, it goes into the IA Pro system. And this is basically just where all the data is held and maintained, and then the analysts later pull this data out and come up with their annual reports and whatnot that they send to the DOJ and put out to the public. So this is an example of a use of force case that was inspected by us last month. So this is one where these officers use safe restraints and hobbles. This is a documented use of force. This is anything above standard handcuffing requires documentation and put in a Blue Team. So like this is a hobble. So what this can do is it can be placed around a person's ankles to try and restrain them further if they're continuing to be violent while in handcuffs, if they're trying to damage property, harm themselves. Officers have the ability to apply a hobble restraint. This here is a safe restraint. This is a little bit more. This has this goes around a person's legs. This harness goes around their chest, and there's a helmet for their head, and basically it holds them in this position right here, in a sat-up position, so that they can be placed in a car, they can be transported safely, and they can be prevented from hurting themselves or hurting anyone else if they continue to resist while in handcuffs. So this is a situation where that happened. So the involved citizen is listed, all the officers that were involved in the application of the safe restraint. So this officer helped with the safe restraint, and there's another page where it'll show the person, and it'll show exactly where Officer Beltran placed body weight or placed a safe restraint piece onto the suspect whenever they did whenever they applied this device. And then from there, there's where does the blue team go? So the supervisor has to accomplish this report, and then from there it goes to the lieutenant. So this sergeant sent it to this lieutenant. This lieutenant then sends it to the crime analyst, and then the crime analyst sent it back for some other approval or may have a clarifying question or something. So this will show the routings of where everything goes and how it's all documented. So this is one of the last slides, and this is the factors that are used to determine the reasonableness of force. Okay, because it's a big task. Like you're looking at a lot of different things, but we're looking at everything the officer does even prior to arriving at a call, prior to coming into contact with a person. The reasonableness of the force is going to be determined on a lot of those factors too. So, I mean, when feasible, officers should provide warning of force to be used. We talked about that. You know, when it's feasible, when it's not going to put an officer or someone else at further danger, then they need to provide a warning that force is going to be used. Okay, if there is someone standing back behind that door and I have barricades in front of me because I have tables here, and I have a feasible amount of time to provide a warning, and they're holding a knife or an axe or something, and they're being aggressive, right? This might be a circumstance where I might have to use force on a person over there. I'm going to advise them, because it's feasible, hey, you need to put that down or you're going to be tased. Give them that warning. Maybe give them a little warning arc. Hey, if you don't put that down, you're going to get tased. And then they start to advance towards me, and then they have the weapon raised. It might be justified for me to tase that person based on the totality of the circumstances. Again, just giving you a random example right now. This isn't to dive in and analyze. It's just so that you kind of wrap your head around what we're going to look at prior to the use of force. Factors to consider during the use of force and what takes place. And then after the use of force occurs, this is where we look at, did the officer apply the department values? Did they have sanctity for the person's life? Are they providing medical assistance as soon as they have the opportunity to? Doing those things like providing community trust and legitimacy, going to talk to the neighbors that might have witnessed what happened and not know all the answers, but all they saw is, you know, an officer picking somebody up and slamming them on the ground. Okay, that neighbor might have questions, and going over and talking to them is going to help to build that community trust and that legitimacy with the community. Any questions?
Is a conversation with a neighbor part of the report?
Yeah, it could be. So, which report are you referring to?
Well, just the illustration you just gave, the example you just
Okay, so yeah, go back to the blue team. So the supervisor will document everyone that they talk to in the blue team. So the officers involved, they write a report. So they have to write a police report on what they were doing, what call they responded to, the factors that were involved in the use of force, even like their perception, the things that were going through their mind. They're going to author all that in a police report. The supervisor's summary here, that's basically going to be them documenting their investigation. There will be a little bit of information in there about this officer responded to this call for service, they were involved in use of force, these were the force types. This is what I did in my investigation. I canvassed the neighborhood for witnesses. I spoke to this witness over here who advised they saw something, and their information is going to now be in that blue team. So that would be documented.
Follow-up conversations that might occur are documented in the report.
Yes, in the blue team report by the supervisor.
I think he's talking about two different, you're talking about the conversations where officers go back to the neighbors who may have witnessed something?
Yes.
Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, the officers they have the ability to write all that into the report. It's not a requirement, but it is something that they can additionally articulate in their reports.
Do they? I'm not being smart here. I'm just trying to figure out, is it the common?
In most circumstances that I've been involved in, that I've seen, it's something that gets handled in the supervisor's actions. The supervisor, for the most part, is the one after the fact that goes through and they talk to the citizens and whatnot. It's not always the case, right? Officers are expected to do this too. But there's nothing that requires them unless they've been a witness to it. Then it would be required. They would need to have that added into their reports. Oh, sorry. I saw that hand high.
So I know you guys use the spit cutters.
Yeah.
Does that fall under your
It is in the policy. It's not at the level of meeting a reportable use of force. So if you go back to the force levels for me, I got a great secretary. So
I think your whole.
yeah. Force levels. So spit hoods are not required for reporting in the current policy. They are explained and they are detailed out on when they should be used, the limitations of them, the restrictions of them, but it's not reportable and documented by the blue team system. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I think just to follow up what you said, I think as far as in that last slide, you said considerations after the fact and trust and transparency. A way of documenting that is making sure it goes into the report so the supervisor, but of course, I know time constraints do not always allow it. So that's, I think that's kind of what you were, or maybe, so that we can follow through with
That's
that.
a really important piece. And it seemed like it would be something that would be really contribute to what we're after here.
And I may have misspoke a little bit because if there's a legitimate witness to what occurred, they will be contacted and that will be in a police report. So if they are a witness to something, use of force that occurs, they will be documented, placed in the police report, and their statement will be documented by an officer. So, that's if they're a witness to something.
Chuck, if an officer goes over, for example, say a senior officer shows up after an incident and goes over and explains to a citizen or a neighbor across the street that looks frustrated or whatever, and they go over and have a conversation with them, it's going to be documented by the body worn camera as well, and so that conversation will be recorded, that explanation will be recorded, so there is documentation of it in that respect.
Yeah, every citizen or community contact will be also documented on the body camera. Did you have something, Andy?
I was just gonna say, some of those things are gonna happen, but they're gonna be documented as like, I didn't find any witnesses, right? And so they're gonna make that as short as possible. So, hey, I went next door, walked around, looked for witnesses, and couldn't find any, and then shorten that to this, right? And then if they find something valuable worth writing, then they're gonna write it and say, hey, I talked to this person, and said this, how this.
I have a few questions, but I know we're gonna spend some more time to actually review the policy. But I appreciate that, like, approaching and, a call for service with the de-escalation approach. But I'm curious to hear about, you said that there will be identified like resources or other toolkits, to use minimal or de-escalate the situation instead of escalate it. I know that some things that I've heard about is just, language access. A lot of officers don't speak the language that, we have beyond English, there's multiple languages in Kern County. So I'm curious of how do officers respond in those situations, and is that outlined in this policy, or what is the current practice?
Well, to partially answer your question, for de-escalation, de-escalation as it's lined out in the policy is required to take place throughout the incident. So again, not just as an officer makes approach and contact, but it's something that's constantly being evaluated. What resources might help in this situation. And if they do identify those roadblocks, right? If I'm just an English-speaking officer and I meet a citizen or a member of the community that speaks another language I'm not familiar with, then we have resources through the communication center. Well, we have officers that are bilingual, right? We have many Spanish-speaking officers, Punjabi-speaking. I think we even have some Tao or something like that. So there's a lot of officers that speak other languages, but if those aren't available, the communication center has resources that we can make contact with the person and communicate through those language access avenues. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Did you talk about Propio? Did I just miss that? The language access app?
No, I didn't mention that. But that's what I think that the communication center uses.
Yeah, we're starting to expand, and if somebody knows whether or not it's out there or not, I know. But we have a language access app that is now available. It should be on all of the officers' phones, so that if you're in the field in contact with someone, you can pull this app and immediately begin engaging them. You can put them on the phone. You could use it in the amplifier, the PA, in the car. Just a variety of things that increase our capacity to do that. Hard to do that and negotiate with somebody when you're over an app. But we have the ability to have interpretation in the field like that.
You mentioned the de-escalation, the new proposed policy, does that include, being able to identify those with mental health challenges, and how are you able to address that? Because she brought a good point up about the language, we also have mental health component as well. How are you able to address that immediately? Considering that, let's say it's, passive non-compliance, how are you able to identify that without it escalating into maybe an assaultive or being life-threatening?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So we address that not just in the de-escalation policy, but especially in the vulnerable populations. Whenever we are training officers on dealing with vulnerable populations, we'll put them through trainings on how to identify maybe someone that's nonverbal with autism or something of that sort. In our simulator, we have over 200, almost 300 different types of scenarios that we can have an officer step into and have to engage with someone on the screen. And there's scenarios in there that involve people with disabilities and involve children and involve all these different walks of life that an officer's gonna have to work their way through and try to identify, okay, this person's not responding in a normal way, maybe I need to recognize that this person might be a nonverbal person with a disability, or they may be hard of hearing or something of that sort. So we have those abilities to train the officers in it, and we address it in the policy, especially with vulnerable populations, but as well as with overall in the de-escalation. As you guys read through it, you'll be able to see that those are some of the things that officers are required to try and identify early on, and then use resources available to them when they make those identifications.
Just following up to that, sorry. Following up to her question is that, I'm curious to know, because I know that the Met team sometimes collaborate, but I'm curious to know, like, how many personnel are actually members of the Met team? Because things that we also heard is that, well, if we don't have anyone to respond other than officers with guns, that's what we're gonna send out to the community. So, yeah, curious to know if you have information on Met team and resources dedicated to that specific.
Yeah, I don't know the exact number of Met officers or employees that are available. I do know that there is coverage 24/7. There's certain times where they might be tied up working on a crisis with someone else and they might not be available, so there definitely are those circumstances. But we have it to the point where even some of our impact officers are assigned to ride with a mental health professional every single day. So they go out in the field every single day, and it's an officer and a mental health professional and a police car, and they respond to specific calls for service that have to deal with mental health. Outside of that, it is something that officers can request. And you'll hear, if you guys have ever listened to the radio scanner or watched some of the live streams, and you start to see some of these calls that the officers respond to that have to deal with mental health, usually on the way there, before they even respond, they're asking, is there a Met unit available that can meet them somewhere prior to, trying to establish contact with the person over the phone, and see if the Met professional can resolve it before an officer even has to make contact.
I can answer that they're not enough. They're very bluntly, there's not enough.
There are 4 full-time co-responsibles in that unit.
So four, they call them our JET units, and it's impact officer and a mental health professional.
That's on top of the regular.
Yeah, and that's on top of the actual Met personnel that ride around in the vans or whatever else they drive and come out to the calls.
And don't forget our
Clinicians in the comm center.
And they're in the comm center? Yeah.
Sorry, I missed that. There's
There's also mental health professionals assigned to the comm center to deal with people that are calling.
Sorry about that. I appreciate that pilot. I hope it's forever.
It's very successful.
Yes.
So 2 questions. The first one is connected to the program that you were talking about, Terry, around, I'm imagining a scenario in which something is, a little bit more than active or passive resistance, where, I'll just ask the question. What sort of cultural competency trainings, and especially identifying languages, that type of stuff, are police officers receiving? Because, for example, yeah, we know that the 3 main languages, English, Spanish, and Punjabi, I think here in Bakersfield, but there's a bunch of super regionally specific dialects from indigenous populations that if you've never heard it, you won't know, but you're gonna assume that this person is speaking some, Spanish or whatever, right? So I'm wondering what sort of cultural competency trainings go alongside that you're in a scenario and you're like, I need to call somebody because I don't speak the language. How are you identifying it? That sort of stuff.
I know that there is, and don't quote me on it because that's not my 100% area of expertise. I was trying to focus on use of force, but whenever it comes to the language access stuff, I believe in the app there's a way for someone to identify or type in or speak their own language, and it'll identify what the language is so that you can find an interpreter. Previously, I remember we had like cards or pamphlets, and it basically had like, do you speak English? Habla español, and I don't speak Spanish, so don't quote me on that. But, you know, it went through all the different languages, and you presented that to the person, and they could go through and say, oh yeah, I speak, you know, this language. And then it would give you the resource on who to contact to get a translator.
The app itself, 350 languages or so. But the other component to your cultural training, exposure, and I don't know, JB or anybody in training staff want to answer that, or I don't know if it's an academy or AO school thing, or.
I know that Edmund.
Well, I'm sure your question is not just access to language, right?
Sure, yeah, like cultural competency training. So now I can go more to a use course question.
Okay, yeah, what's your use course question?
It doesn't seem, linearly, it doesn't seem to make sense that pointing your firearm at a particular person is a level 1 minimum force, because wouldn't you be incentivized to continue using a gun as you're pointing it? Because the way that you have it set up, right, you can pull your gun out, but you're gonna have to put your gun away in order to take somebody down. And so I can just see that sort of inside folks' head, quickly escalating something from a level 1 to like a level 3, right, without skill. So I'm wondering, and we mentioned this before, does it make sense to have brandishing, or I guess brandishing is when the bad guys do it, quote unquote. Does it make sense linearly, like logically, to have pulling your gun out and pointing it at a member of the community as a level 1, when you have to put it away in order to engage with all the other different tactics of de-escalation?
That's a great question. And to answer it, we don't use force linearly, right? We don't start with level 1 and then go to level 2 and then go to level 3 and then go to level 4, because things are dynamic. They change and they happen very fast, right? So you might start off with a level 1, you know, just trying to de-escalate somebody, arcing your taser, and then all of a sudden it escalates to a level 3 or a level 4. Like, it can skip into all these different levels of force. So we don't work on a continuum where you have to go from one level of force to another. If you have the opportunity to, then you should try and start with the lowest level of force possible, and then work towards a point where you gain compliance or you have control. But what this is doing is it's non-contact force, pretty much. So if it ends at that point, you know, if there's just an officer pointing their gun at a person and then they comply, they lay on the ground and there's compliance, we still want to document and report that metric. We want to know how often officers are pointing their guns at people and how often it's working to gain compliance. Because in hindsight, I mean, that may be a form of de-escalation. You know, pointing a gun at someone, they might think, okay, this officer means business, they're serious, I'm going to comply with what they're doing. And then an officer, and we go through trainings on officers having to go from those high levels of force, or what could be high levels of force, pointing a gun at someone, right? The next step after that you would think is deadly force, right? But we train officers, we put them through high-risk scenarios on, okay, you have your gun out, you got sent to this scary call, this person had a gun, now all of a sudden they discarded the gun and they're just coming at you with their fists up. Like, can you shoot this guy? Like, how many times have you guys heard of a good shoot where somebody's just walking at an officer with their fists up, nothing in their hand? It's probably not going to be a justified shooting. So we train officers to create that distance, holster while being able to react, and then go to these level 2 controlling force options, going to a takedown and going hands-on and having to, you know, more or less grapple or ground fight with someone. So we train them in that aspect, but I appreciate how you are looking at it, like, you know, linearly and logistically. It doesn't make sense to like start here, point a gun at somebody, and then all of a sudden I have to put it away and deal with all this other stuff. But a use of force is dynamic and it doesn't take place in a linear fashion.
Sure. I guess more than the linearity of it is that that's a pretty big, right? Like somebody pointing a gun at an officer with no intent to use it, obviously, that's not passive resistance, right? So a police officer using a gun, whether or not, I just, in my head, every time, you know, a gun's been pointed, you know, that feels like an escalation rather than like a de-escalation. And so in the interest of escalation, and again, I'm sure the thoughts are, well, you're not a police officer, so you don't have to, so I'm just curious about, yeah, your thinking on that.
I have an answer maybe.
Yeah.
So, it could start out as a deadly force situation. Like, I could have a knife, I have to pull my firearm out. I point it at him. By pointing it at him, I'm de-escalating, hey, drop the knife, like, we don't wanna have to hurt you, right? He drops the knife, and now he follows all of my commands. We take him into custody with no force, right? It's just a way to capture that, hey, we pointed our firearm at him. We're not trying to hide that, right? We want to capture these instances where not every time we point a firearm at someone are we shooting them. That's not, we don't wanna have to kill people, we wanna help people. And so this is a way to capture, like that's an easy scenario maybe to understand. That guy has a knife, it's a deadly force situation. So we're at level 4. Now all of a sudden he drops the knife, he's complying. We take him in custody with no force. Like, cool, we went all the way down to level 1. Yeah. I don't know what that means.
And real quick, so we're getting close on time, and this is not gonna be the end of use of force, obviously. We're gonna, and Stephanie and I have talked, and she'll come up and we'll kind of talk about the next couple items so we can get you out of here on time. But what we potentially foresee is next month, and we'll talk more about time-wise, but actually breaking down, if we get another speaker to come in, great. But having our use of force team, because you guys have mentioned the benefit of potentially breaking up into subgroups, and having Sergeant Bishop and the rest of his team breaking up into groups, so you can ask these questions and go through the policy on a more intimate level and discuss these things and hear directly from them. And they'll be able to answer all your questions. There'll be no questions left unanswered, hopefully. By the time we get to use of force and the point where we say, okay, please review the policy now and provide us your recommendations. So along the lines of that, one of the things that was brought up when we met with Stephanie the last week was about the potential use of the simulator, and who would be interested in the simulator. I know a couple of folks had advised, hey, you should put it out to the group. Would anybody, as far as the cap, who has not been through it or even has gone through it in the past, would you be interested in going through our simulator, our use of force simulator?
Ryan, if I could, comment real quick, I know where I'm fine. I brought this up, the possibility of doing that for all of the CAP members last month, because I have been through it, and it does educate you a little bit. It helps give you a little better perspective on what potentially could happen in a use of force situation. My first situation, I was dead in 3 seconds. 3 seconds, that was it, I was gone. And I learned a lot. What we're trying to do, and I think what all of us, me included, need to do is learn as much as we can from our speakers, from opportunities such as a simulator, going on a ride-along. If you've never done a ride-along, holy smoke, do a ride-along and just sit in that seat and watch the officer work. And I mean, I'm doing volunteer work, and I'm sitting in my own patrol vehicle trying to listen to a radio and figure out what in the world they're saying. I don't have to look at the computer. I don't have to pay attention to a lot of the other things that the officers do. I'm learning a lot, and it does inform me and help me make, I hope, better decisions and contributions to the group.
Thank you for that, sir. Would anybody else be interested, or maybe the best way to do this is between this meeting and next month's meeting, is I can put out an email to the group, and if you're interested, we can either open up next month's meeting a little bit early, because our simulator's at our police station, and we can do it before class starts or before the meeting starts, or get with the DT crew and figure out a couple of times between now and July or January 9th, where you could sign up and we could host you and put you through it. So we want to give you as much information as we can get you that you feel would be relevant before we send you off to make the recommendations before next month's meeting. So what's that?
Highly recommended.
So if you guys would go with that, I will put it out, and I'll get a level of interest, and then we can communicate and figure out the best time to do it. For those of you who are interested, I would highly encourage you to do it, and we can kind of see how that works. Is that an okay plan moving forward as it relates to simulator? Stephanie, do you want to talk about the last item?
Yeah, I think we were interested in gauging folks' interest in breaking up into subgroups to discuss different policies and work through the policies. You know, not everyone might be interested in like the use of force policy, for example, and so having like a subgroup that works specifically on like the use of force policy, or a subgroup that works on a different policy, and in that way sort of just like break up the work and streamline the work so that we can move it forward on a more timely basis.
the kind of, the way she relayed it to me in the meeting is that, like, in between meetings, if there's a group that's really heavy on doing the revisions and diving into the nuts and bolts of it, so to speak, if you have that level of interest or enthusiasm, to be able to have sub-meetings, and then we could provide, like she said, usually you guys do it by Zoom, and the other group that you're a part of, and then we can provide as an organization some folks from our DT team or defensive tactics team or use of force team to be there to be able to answer questions as you're working through stuff, and just kind of create some availability and some working space that we would assist with. So I think just kind of gauging anybody interested in that.
Are we talking about then reporting what we do in that to the big group then? So we could, because that, when we had the other subgroups, that was part of the frustration, is that we did all this work, but we never got to report it to the
Yeah.
group. Yeah.
Well, I think that's important, and I think, yes, and as Chief Terry has mentioned, we want at the end of use of force, one document from all of the groups, right? So whatever you come up with, sharing it with the groups, hopefully the new Conveyo system, as we get more familiar with it, allows you the space to do that. But I think we'll kind of rely upon the group to figure out how to do that.
Yeah, I think like Rosa, for example, has experience with the KCSO CAC space, breaking up into subgroups, and they meet, there's a regular monthly meeting with the CAC, and then in between there's like these Zoom meetings, as Ryan was saying, where folks who are interested in, like the revisions of the policy or like particular parts of the policy, to really like join together and sort of flesh that out, and not just rely on this 2-hour space to try to get and absorb all of the information and work through all of the revisions of the policy, and then, in that way sort of also better collaborate with one another outside of the space and finding time with one another to work through the policy, because, especially use of force, it's a huge policy. It's a really important policy, and it's going to take a little bit of time to like sort of really like go through the entire policy and make sure that the revisions are good.
Did we break down into subgroups on the other,
On the canine policy?
Yeah, did we?
Yeah, we did a variation of it. I think with the canine policy though, we divided it by sections, and I don't know that that's necessarily very fruitful, because especially for like the use of force policy, everything sort of relates to one another. Like you have to have an understanding of the definitions up front to really be able to sort of understand how it plays into like other sections of the policy. And so like breaking it up into like just, page 1 through 3, this group, page 4 to 6, this group, like is not really conducive to that. So this would be like subgroups who are, like a subgroup who really wants to dive into the nitty gritty of like policy revision can. That,
just so
yeah.
I'm playing this clear in my head, and I know we need to get out of here. So the subcommittees that we're talking about, are they the only ones doing the policy and delving deep in there? So, because when I think of subcommittees, I think we're breaking this up into subcommittees and actually delving deep in that. Are you just picking one particular group just to delve into the policy alone, and then we have to wait for them to report back to us what the findings are, and nobody else has any, kind of say or overview of it? So I'm just trying to figure out, because that's what it sounds like to me, and I would be for that. I think we all need to figure out, we need to figure out something, but just having one subgroup just dove in it and feed us the information would be just like some of us accuse the PD of doing.
If I can, because I also, I like this proposal, because I think it is not realistic to meet once a month, 2 hours, and say that we're gonna finish this policy by February, for example. It is not realistic if we actually are intending to go line by line and really understand, and again, so I think how it works in the other space is that there is a work group, not necessarily subcommittees, but work groups that are more interested in actually diving into use of force and meet on a bi-weekly basis for 2 hours to go line by line. And so that, we completed the use of force. It took us 4 months, the subcommittees, but it's open to everyone, saying that if, understanding that this is a volunteer time, but being realistic, 2 hours to say, let's review this policy and submit a recommendation in a month, it's not realistic. And so are we saying that if we just wanna continue meeting once a month, are we okay with submitting our revision by like, I don't know, April, May?
But do we have to use the word subcommittee? I think that's the
Work
question.
group.
I think that's true.
Because do you have to use the word subcommittee? If you're gonna meet weekly, just meet weekly and do a Zoom. But if you call it a subcommittee, it makes it sound like you're separated. So take the subcommittee off the table and just say, there's a meeting every week for Zoom, and those are gonna log in.
Yeah.
I wouldn't label it subcommittee.
Yeah, I think the work, I think I said work group.
Working
I
group
think
makes
there was
sense.
definitely terms gonna throw around, but I said work group.
Go ahead, T, and then we're gonna wrap this up.
Could this new facilitator help us reconcile this?
Yeah, I think that could be very beneficial to work this out once we get that new facilitator.
Streamline what it is, because I get what she's saying, but to help us kind of.
Yeah, and we want to just introduce this to you guys as a group, something that she asked and that we're open to. We support any system or mechanism that will help us get work done faster and efficient and continue to drive purpose and understanding of all the procedures and things that we want to do and adhere to. So, kind of with that being said, that could be something we can follow up with the facilitator when it comes. And then I'll send out an email gauging interest or who'd be interested in doing our simulator, and then we can get that scheduled. And then we'll continue to work hopefully a little bit sooner for the next meeting so we can get the agenda out sooner, so we can get January planned out.
I wanna thank you guys for staying on time.
And this will all be on Conveo by tomorrow, so if you guys do wanna read more into it, I know that we went through it quick, it'll all be on there tomorrow. So you guys can,
Chief, anything, sir? No. All right. Have a blessed evening.